Thanks very much for having us, Housmans, and thanks very much everybody for coming. I'm Dan Hancox.A. I've known Hettie for some time, and have been reading her work for some time, to the point that I didn't really need to write an intro for this particular event. I've been awaiting the asset class with great anticipation, having read a lot of the journalism that went into it and heard about the fascinating trips that Hettie had been on. This took you quite a way. Well, I'll put that in the form of a question a little bit later. But there has been travel involved in this book about kind of immaterial finance that sort of is sort of not materially visible. Has involved a lot of travelling to real world locations and seeing the real world impacts. I should say from the top, really, I am not someone who finds economics either easy or thrilling with a regular basis. Like, it's an important part of my politics, or it ought to be, to understand the sort of worst excesses of the capitalist system. The actual detail points of how finance works, I think a lot of us on the left find quite challenging, and so it's all the more important to have people like Hettie who are able to write about it with such clarity and wit and make it entertaining. I mean, this is a genuinely entertaining book, and it's one that I would recommend to you in those terms, as well as a book that is enraging and important, which it absolutely is, in explaining the sort of relatively recent form that global capitalism has found in the form of private equity. So if you want a sort of spirit guide to the world of funds and leveraged buyouts, then Hettie is your guide, and this book, The Asset Class, is the perfect way of opening it up. I'll add actually that I mentioned that my friend Hettie was writing this book a few years ago to a pal in New York who works in climate finance, and so his job is to try and persuade some of the most wealthy people in the world, often with politics that he would not share and I would not share, to divert their funds into away from fossil capitalism. And when I mentioned to him that a friend in London was writing a book about private equity, he said, this is the book that we need at this moment. And having read it, I can only agree. So let me start off just by asking you, Hettie, if you probably ought to start at the top and just sort of say what private equity is, and how it is distinct from other forms of fund or ways of investing wealth.
Yeah, and I think there is a tendency to almost just say that's private equity as if it's sort of absolutely everywhere, which, to be fair, it is everywhere, but it's almost become a shorthand for some of the problems and depredations of our economy that we see today, whether that's the takeover of Gales or the reason that your vet practice has become really expensive. And it often gets used as a sort of precursor to the term institutification as well. But I think that private equity, when I try and explain it to people, I think the clue is partly in the name, in the sense that it's private. So a private equity fund will take over a company, traditionally delisting its shares from the stock market, and that will mean that you can't really see what is going on with that company in the way that you formerly could. So it's almost like a kind of veil of opacity that is being draped over vast areas of economic activity. And so it's very secretive, and that posed a number of challenges when I started writing and researching the book, and informed the way that I tried to tell the stories both within the industry in a way that was finding interesting characters and people who could speak to the kind of incredible evolution of this insanely powerful, insanely shadowy form of finance that really does dominate everywhere, where we live, where we work, the places where we even go on to die, care homes and so on. But also, when you actually want to understand what private equity is, you really do have to dive into the mechanics. And I've tried to do so in a way, hopefully without alienating people or turning people off who aren't necessarily people who think of themselves as interested in finance. And so when I try and explain those mechanics, they always involve something called a leveraged buyout, which Dan has mentioned. If you think about the way that you or I might buy something using a credit card, we would borrow the money to buy something and eventually expect to pay it off. But private equity as a form of ownership is totally different to that. And it really is quite incredible and quite scandalous when you think about how it works. And when I talk to people about this, their question is always, how did they get away with that?
Genuinely.
And so in a leverage buyout, a private equity fund will, as I said, buy a company, but it will do so using a vast proportion of debt, i.e. borrowed money. And rather than the fund managers being responsible for eventually paying off that debt will be pushed down onto the company itself, which means that the company ends up vastly indebted. And that has one really important effect, which is that when a company is so laden with debt, it means it has less money to spend on doing the things that it should be doing or you'd think it ought to be doing, whether that's making cakes or looking after your elderly relative or all of the kind of social and productive functions that companies serve. Those are almost become almost secondary to the vast kind of debt that has been accumulated, which means that all of the cash flow of that company ends up going towards paying off that debt. So that's really important, but also I think when you think about how that ends up shafting responsibility onto little people, I think that's quite significant as well. It's really almost a metaphor for how power works, in the sense that it's the people who aren't in control who end up paying the price of this. And so, as I said, it's the fund managers who end up pushing that debt downwards onto companies, but it's the people who work for those companies, the suppliers of those companies, the end consumers, the public, if those companies are providing a public service, who end up paying the price of that. So without wanting to get too technical to begin with, it is, I think it's important to understand that, and I do think it's a really significant form of ownership that totally changes how we think about what owning something means. I think when we think of owning something, we think that means kind of maybe taking care of it, maybe hoping it will still exist in 5 years' time. Private equity as a form of ownership does not ask those same questions of the things that it owns, and that's really significant.
It's like they've gone with great power comes great responsibility, and the private equity firms have said no, but we don't really want the responsibility, and somehow they've been allowed to get away with that.
Yeah.
Could you chart for us on an imaginary graph? I'm just asking this because I'm sort of a historian and I'm always inclined this way. What's the point? Is it after the global financial crisis in 2008 that suddenly the reach of private equity firms expands massively, their sort of their talons in every aspect of our lives?
Yeah.
Is it because there are precursors which are sketched out brilliantly, the sort of pioneers of this form of investment prior to 21st century.
Yeah, and I think I always have to be careful when I'm talking about this subject, because sometimes I have a tendency to preface everything I say with, it sounds boring but is really important. And actually it isn't boring at all. And I think this is something that people often struggle with, or at least the left often struggles with, is a sense in which this is basically the dominant form of ownership today. And I think it's really important we understand that. And it's important we understand the scale of that as well. I mean, this really, private equity is invested in every single area of your life. From the company that pumps water into your home, the company that owns the rental apartment that you perhaps live in if you're in the US, or increasingly if you're in the UK, the company that owns a student accommodation where you rented as when you were studying, the company that cares for your children when you take them to nursery. And that process, at least that scale of ownership, really has taken it off post 2008. It's a really important juncture for a number of reasons. Partly that I think one of the things that I was realizing as I was researching this, and one of the reasons I got interested in it, was after 2008, there was this sense in which all of the public's attention was directed towards banks, firstly, but also secondarily towards the idea of debt and kind of the idea that debt was somehow a form of public recklessness. I think if you've seen The Big Short, there's this scene in which there's a stripper who is talking about the number of mortgages she's taken out, and it feels as though that's like the moment at which the 2008 crisis gets almost memorialized in the public imagination as a sort of cultural artifact to understand how we look at that moment. And actually, private equity is becoming increasingly powerful in this moment, and yet nobody is really paying attention to it because of that focus on banks and bankers and the misdeeds of the financial sector, a particular part of the financial sector. And so there is this sense in which private equity is almost behind the scenes accumulating a vast form of power and investing, or buying up. The term investment often gets misused. Buying up things that we rely upon. So yeah, 2008 is a really important moment, but
we were sort of looking the wrong way in that moment,
we were definitely looking.
aftermath.
We were definitely looking the wrong way, and I think when I started looking into this, it was almost as though I went to university. I graduated a few years after the financial crisis. There was this public conversation going on then. I was, as a journalist, really interested in stories to do with public services, with housing, with these, I guess, with the role that the state plays in our everyday lives. And every time I'd be looking at one of these stories or ideas for stories, not every time, but with increasing regularity, this names of these companies would keep cropping up, these private equity firms. And I just, at first, didn't really know that much about them. I knew a couple of people who worked in the industry, but it wasn't something that I'd really done much reading on. And it just seemed as though, yeah, after 2008, this industry had perfected this really kind of cradle to grave model of investment that encompassed every single area of our lives. Now, I say that, but actually, it's not the only important juncture. And in the book, I kind of go back to the 1970s and to all of these crazy financial crusaders who believe that they have discovered in the leverage buyout a kind of incredible tool that will help rouse America from its economic stupor. And then that gets imported to the UK as this shining model of investment that is supposed to deliver unto Britons this idea of Silicon Valley. And actually, we don't really get that. We get the kind of T.G. Jones and the various other Claire's accessory buyouts and so on. So there is like this sense in which it goes back further as well. And I think I try and make that clear in the book.
You do, but there was idealism in that moment as well, though. That there might be a goal beyond just purely the enrichment of the few people.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I guess I wanted to read this partially. I wanted to read this in good faith because I think it's kind of important to almost test something at its own test the claims that it makes in a sense. And so one of the people I looked into a lot was this guy William Simon, who is this incredible figure who kind of got forgotten about a bit in the history books. And he was a bond trader at Salomon Brothers in the 1970s, and he was quite a caustic, polarizing guy who ended up basically alienating a lot of people around him. This was a recurring theme, these guys who kept falling out with their friends and families and were estranged from various...
Telling, perhaps, yes.
Perhaps. And he had become increasingly fixated on the idea of working in the American government, and he went to work under Richard Nixon, and he grew really angry at the sense in which he was going to work in a period when there was this long hangover from the kind of, I guess, New Deal era of great social spending and an attempt to combat various social ailments to do with poverty and so on. And he basically saw these forms of government spending and thought that's the absolute opposite of what we should be doing, and we should really be reining this in. And his political instincts, were kind of famously described once as to the right of Genghis Khan. And so he really is, a
But we live in his world now, isn't it?
But we are really living in William Simon's world. He makes a number of trips to Russia during the Cold War, the early 1970s. And so it's the early 1970s, he's going over to Russia as the Treasury Secretary under Richard Nixon. He's having caviar with Brezhnev and saying, hey, these Soviet guys, they're actually quite nice, but I totally disagree with everything they're doing. And I'm really worried that basically the communist experiment is this kind of sickness that is going to spread outwards from America and infect Europe and then outwards from Russia and infect Europe and then infect America. And he sees this as a kind of world historical moment in which America's free market system truly is under threat. And so he basically discovers, he ends up wanting to go into the Reagan administration, doesn't quite make it there. Reagan takes a look at him and thinks, this guy's actually too much. He wants too much power. I can't really deal with this. So Simon ends up going back into business, and he sets up one of the first leverage buyout shops in the US. And he does this incredible leverage buyout on Gibson Greetings, which is the company that owns Garfield the cat. And he thinks that these leveraged buyouts are basically the recipe for defeating almost the Soviet threat by kind of uncovering America's natural entrepreneurial spirit. And I said that I was trying to do a good faith reading of this. I think that's like the good faith reading, that you think you've discovered something that is incredibly useful for breathing life into a stagnant economy. The more cynical reading is that the leverage buyout form matches quite closely with the type of politics that Simon and his acolytes had always had in mind. They were basically a group of guys who grew up during the end of the New Deal, saw public spending as anathema to the project of what government should be about, and wanted to take American government, American politics back to a period of almost pre-democracy, of pre-1929, checks on power that were created in the middle of the 20th century. And they were really diametrically opposed to democracy. And when you look at something like the leveraged buyout, you see how it really accumulates power in the hands of a very small select group of people, that it involves the use of debt in a way that accrues largely to these small group of financial insiders. And that as a form of ownership, private equity, the clue is in the word private. It involves telling as little as possible to people like you or I. And so I was sort of thinking, okay, the good faith reading of this is that it's an idealist project. The bad faith, or the cynical / perhaps more accurate reading of it is that this was nothing to do with actually rejuvenating an economy with the idea of actually benefiting lots of people. It was all about reversing an economy back to a period of when there were fewer democratic controls on capital and on extremely rich oligarchic individuals. And I came across a number of quotes from private equity insiders when I was writing the book, where they're quite honest about this. They say private equity is not a democracy. Perhaps it has to be that way for the results to be as good as they are. And you're kind of thinking, yeah, as a form of ownership, this really is almost the end of democracy, because it involves, as I've said, telling very little to people and concentrating power upwards.
Both internally anti-democratic, but also in terms of its place and its relationship with the various forms that we might see of electoral or other democracy.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the kind of political project that those people are trying to achieve, there's no surprise that Simon plays this really important role in helping to craft the Mandate for Leadership, which is the document that is created to help inform the Reagan administration, to help inform the policies that the Reagan administration will put into place. And that then gets updated, as we know, as Project 2025. But it really is this idea of, the true liberalism in a true sense was only really true pre-1929, and we want to turn back the innovation, the regulations and the kind of big government of the 20th century, and restore power to a small unelected group of
Make it seem like a blip, basically.
Yeah,
like the welfare statism of the
isn't
mid-20th century. Yeah.
Isn't that what's happening now, in the sense of we're seeing how the welfare state, or at least that period of 20th century history, does increasingly feel like a blip, and I feel like that's very dark. But also, as I was writing this, I was thinking private equity is not only does it match quite closely with the macroeconomic situation we find ourselves in terms of quite an unproductive, low-growth economy where it's easier to build wealth through leveraged speculation than it is to build wealth through actual productive activity, but it also matches quite closely with the political environment we now find ourselves in. So it was really interesting to go back to some of the kind of founding figures and their ideas, and to see where they wanted to go politically, because it helped me explain a bit more, or it helped me understand, a bit more about where we find ourselves now. And I think there's often a tendency to view the politics and the figures involved in, say, the second Trump administration as these aberrations who are just evil, stupid, and so on. And those things all may be true, but I think that if you want to understand if you want to understand the right, you've got to look at if you want to understand how the right looks at government, look at how the right views its firms, I suppose, and the idea that corporate ownership can help you, looking at that in detail can help you understand then how the right is controlling government in the present moment.
There's a lot of very, relevant figures from the world of politics. Trump appears, and so does, I mean, he's politically relevant Abramovich as well at one point.
Yeah, and when at first I was like, oh, it's just a coincidence that whether the same group of guys keep cropping up around Trump. Maybe they just, big money funds American politics. That's a classic story of like lobbying and whatever. But actually, when you look at the extent to which private equity figures feature within the first Trump administration, perhaps less so now within the second one, but there still is a really important relationship there and an affinity between those two projects.
And it's also feeding, like there's a couple of points in the book where you sort of, speculate with fairly compellingly that there is a connection between the current rise of far-right populism and some of the practices of private equity firms. And that, that you've given sort of one example there, but could you also talk about sort of the wider thing of what happens when our assets are sort of run into the ground like this? There's things about affordable housing across Europe, for example.
And to be clear, like I think that leverage buyouts and private equity are a really good way in and a prism through which to understand a whole lot of other economic and political tendencies. I'm not saying private equity is absolutely to blame for every single thing that is bad, but obviously there is a sense in which when you look at that form of ownership and when you look at the way in which, I suppose, take something like housing, which was a subject that I cover in the book. I ended up spending a lot of time in Denmark. When I first started reporting on Blackstone, it was through this, it was because I was interested in this really kind of crazy campaign to push Blackstone out of Denmark that had taken off. And it was one of the few successful cases in which it felt like social democracy might be working. And there were lots of caveats to that in the sense that everybody likes to put Denmark on a pedestal, forgetting that it's quite a racist country with various problems of its own. Still, they do a number of things right, and they do have a sense that actually housing is something that ought to be protected. And when I was looking at that, I was sort of thinking, that the general sense in which the assets that we depend upon, that we need, the access to those does help to foster some sense, I suppose, in which society, the economy is working for you. And when those become increasingly expensive and further out of reach, it's no surprise that people end up tilting to the right to kind of, I guess, filter their grievances through that particular political project. And so there's research showing that, I think it was maybe it's some of the research I cited from Italy, was it, or Germany perhaps, where a social scientist had gone out.
I think it was Germany. I've read it more recently than you have.
I think it was, there was a paper from Germany where a social scientist had gone out and looked at the extent to which rent increases are a factor in driving support for the AFD, and have managed to find this incredible statistic whereby I think if your rent went up by a certain number of euros, your likelihood of voting for the AFD would also go up. And so it was a kind of one of those examples of, that feels more just more than correlation. It's actually quite an interesting pattern. Conversely, you also get this sense in which, and this is something I was kind of struggling with when I was writing the book, that there are people for whom this current system works quite well. So there is that paper by Ben Ansel and David Adler that shows that people whose houses went up in value in the preceding 10 years were less likely to vote for Brexit because actually they felt as though things were working pretty well for them. They didn't feel the appeal of a kind of right-wing project quite as much. This isn't to say that those people were somehow politically progressive, far from it. People who have high house prices are also shown to be less supportive for social democratic policies such as redistributive policies, because they're more likely to have the sense that they have their own social safety net and they don't need that provided by the state. And that creates all these weird allegiances where you have this sense in which, particularly in a country like Britain, where we have such inflated asset values, it's really difficult to know where to start in terms of resolving some of these tendencies, because somebody whose house price has gone up in value sort of has the same weird interest in interest rates remaining low as your average private equity fund manager, who has also capitalised on interest rates remaining low over the preceding 2 decades or however long it's been. And so there are these weird, coalitions and interest groups that end up forming, and it feels as though it becomes really difficult to see a way through that path and to kind of chart a course towards something that is truly progressive and is more social democratic, I think. So, yeah.
But don't worry, we're going to do that at the end. So.
Yeah, sorry.
With your help. No, genuinely, I am going to ask some questions about sort of, pushback and what kind of grassroots or indeed parliamentary kind of progress in limiting some of the reach here might look like. But I think it would also be good to perhaps just get across to people what the enshittification side of this looks like. What happens to an asset like a network of care homes. I've actually written down one of the stats to save you looking it up, which was in one, I don't know if it was one care home or a series of care homes that were bought by a private equity firm where deaths rose by 11% within a year. Wow. And there may be other factors. There are always lots of complicating things. We don't want to imply everything is a direct causal relationship, as you say, but this does seem to sort of happen time and again, that there is a degradation in the quality of the service provided, whatever that service might be. And actually, I'll just throw in here as well that, because this astonished me, that along with the sort of cradle to grave assets, the nurseries, the care homes, the student housing, the water companies, the things that are structurally vital for all of us to live our lives. Private equity companies have also bought up Nelly Furtado's back catalogue, the London Dungeon, so the London Eye as well. Shares in a popular oat milk brand and a dating app.
Oh, Legoland as well.
And Legoland, thank you. That's
There's also others. I mean, yeah. Maybe I've asked two different questions here. I'd like to hear about the enshittification side. And sort of how the private equity companies explain that away or don't. I also want to know why they bought Nelly Furtado's back catalogue, but maybe we'll leave that. I think the answer is probably IP. It's the term that you have coined previously, which is IP rentierism, i.e., which Dan can. You're more of an expert on this.
I just wouldn't have thought Nelly Furtado's back catalogue was a sort of an intellectual property asset that was going to rise in value.
Maybe they're underestimating the appeal of Nelly Furtado.
Or maybe they're enshittifying that. Yeah, sort of reducing the quality of the. Anyway. Maybe we should focus on the more serious stuff. Although, if anyone's been to Legoland recently, do let us know if it's gone down in quality.
I think.
Yeah, sorry, the serious question.
I mean, with the care stuff, I think it's really. You said that it might not be causal. I do think that actually, with that particular stat that you pulled out, the 11% increase in mortality rates there is a really persuasive case to be made that is a direct effect of private equity ownership. And that does come back to the leverage buyout stuff that I was talking about. When a company is massively indebted, it just has less money to spend on doing other shit, whether that's looking after someone, making something, whatever it is. And that is the fundamental principle here that means that the company is more exposed. It has to search for ways of cutting costs. It has to become, well, in the kind of private equity historic lexicon, meaner, leaner, more efficient. There is this idea that debt is supposed to serve as a sort of salutary medicine that will breathe life into tired companies by ensuring that their managers don't have the financial freedom to take out 5 different memberships to golf courses and get them paid by the company. Or like there was a really great story I came across about some manager going on this really extensive clay pigeon shooting weekend where they basically somebody positioned all of the clay pigeons in a way that was like the easiest possible shooting thing that you could imagine, and then they drove them around, and it was sounded like quite a lot of fun, to be honest, if you're about it. Yeah,
sounds like an elaborate extended metaphor to me. But
yeah, that didn't make it into the book, but the one that did was the story about the Ross Johnson, who was a former CEO of this big conglomerate that got targeted in a really famous buyout, and he took his pet German Shepherd. He sent his pet German Shepherd after biting somebody and potentially getting put down in one state because it had bitten somebody. It then got escorted on a private jet to another state by a member of staff, and all of this got paid for by the company. So there is this idea historically that basically company managers need to be disciplined, and debt is a great way of doing that. And there's a lot of kind of work that went into that, the creation of that myth, because it is a myth, because there's never been any kind of empirical evidence showing that this discipline of debt works. But certainly when it comes to things like care homes, I think it does have a really tangible and mortal effect. And I think when you look at, it's also the case, there was a really good study of care homes in Britain during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, and those that were most indebted had a death rate that was like twice as high as those with no debt at all. So there is a sense of like weakness and exposure. I think throughout this I was like, this is really depressing. This is such a depressing story. How do you tell this in a way that is not depressing? And that was a real kind of stylistic challenge that I encountered a number of times. And in the case of care, I was like, okay, the best way of doing that is by turning the lens on people who have actually, the winners of the situation, rather than just the losers, i.e. the people who have ended up, you know, in a terrible care home, or have ended up spending their life savings on something that was really not good. And so I kind of ended up following around these care home entrepreneurs, which is a funny term. You would not really want a care home and entrepreneur to be in the same sentence usually, but and speaking to private equity fund managers who had seen care as a kind of interesting sector to move into in the 80s and 90s, and really trying to understand also how they viewed the world. And one of the things that really came out of that was that basically nobody thinks that this has worked well. And even the people who are kind of arch defenders of this model, I mean, they would argue, some of them would argue, well, actually it shouldn't have a place in care. So it does feel as though even if you claim to love capitalism, you're not going to love private equity and care homes.
So everyone's disavowing it, even the sort of architects
it's
and
easier
beneficiaries.
and it's easier to
convenient.
It's easier and more convenient to disavow something that's publicly unpopular once you've already made lots of money from it, and you can then have your kind of grandstanding position from your tax haven. But it's still, it does speak to the sense in which something has gone really wrong if nobody thinks this is working.
Right.
And even Josh Simons was like on Twitter the other day, we need to get private equity out of care homes. And I was like, this is very unusual that you find me agreeing with Josh Simons on something.
It's the MP that helped get Starmer into power, and look how well that's going.
But it was like interesting as a sort of, you're like, oh, I wonder what, anyway, that's...
Well, no, this segues perfectly into the next question I wanted to ask, really, which was sort of about how you carried yourself in the room with the people who were the sort of, you know, if not the architects of, then certainly some of the investment bankers or fund managers that you spoke to, people from the world of finance, let's say, rather than some of the activists and politicians, people attempting to push back that are also interviewed in the book. That first category, how did you find that? Like, were you greeted warmly, welcomed into the room? I mean, did you say I'm from The Guardian? Did that help? Did that hinder you? It's written. This book is written in a way that I think of, you know, holds back from like furious polemic, because it doesn't need to. It's very subtle, the anger, because the facts themselves are quite enraging, I would say.
Yeah, and I really wanted, it would have been really easy to write a book that basically spoke to just, there were private equity critics at kind of 10 a penny, and if you want to speak to some people who know stuff about this but are critical of it, it's really easy to find people in trade unionists, workers, care workers, all sorts of people. And I wanted to feature their perspectives in the book, but I also wanted to make sure that it felt as though if somebody who worked in this industry picked this book up, that they would also recognise aspects of it. And I wanted to speak to people who had made money from this and understand, and to speak to people who are really wealthy. And
it's vital. I mean, you know, it's an opaque world, as you say. We're pulling back the veil.
And to speak to people who would defend this. And I think the thing that I've learned through doing so, which kind of was something that I was doing already before I wrote the book, but I think writing the book really helped sort of prove this in practice, was that you can never assume that somebody won't speak to you. And as a journalist, you're always, there's a tendency to kind of think, oh, this feels like a long shot, this interview won't come off. But it's always worth sending the email and seeing what happens. And then speaking to people in a way that makes your criticisms of the industry quite clear, but not going in with any kind of agenda or any kind of preformed opinion, and really speaking to people in good faith and trying to understand how they see the world, because I think that's really what you want to do. You want to understand somebody else's viewpoint. And I think sometimes I think of it almost like as a kind of like this sounds a bit lofty, but sort of like an anthropologist would think of the thing that they talk about, which is called positionality, i.e. you're thinking about how your position in relation to your subject affects your subject's view of you, and therefore the research that you end up producing. And I do think there's like a gendered aspect to this. Perhaps it's easier sometimes as a woman to be in those spaces where there is this kind of like, hey, let me just explain to you how my world works, and this kind of slightly like, hey, little lady, like, but not in a dodgy way, just in like I want to maybe
just
sometimes,
a sexist way. But, yeah.
To some extent, yeah.
Interesting.
And I think it's sometimes, I think you're unavoidably always, because of how you present or whatever, there's always going to be an aspect by which you will get let into certain spaces and not others. I found it easier than one might assume to get let into spaces where elites circulate, private members clubs, fund managers, those kinds of things. But I do think it also comes back to that thing of, be a good journalist. Maybe that's it. Just like try and be a good reporter.
It's a minimal demand, but it's one that some people felt
and not assume that people wouldn't speak to you, and be honest about what you think, but don't be kind of prejudging things.
I mean, even people who might, view a journalist arriving from The Guardian as the enemy, often it's, want to narrate their own story. They want to put their side across, don't they?
Yeah, and it's funny,
that's very useful.
Yeah, and it's also like I guess it's the sort of, it would be silly of them to assume that I had a kind of particular. They'd be doing the same thing in reverse if they were like Guardian journalist. It's a bit.
Can I ask about sort of relatedly, like what happened when you went to some of these, multi-$100 billion companies and asked them for a right of reply, which is something legally you have to do if you want your book to come out at all without being sued into the ground.
Yeah.
And I should add on Hettie's behalf, this was like very closely read by a lawyer, or possibly more than one lawyer, right?
Yeah, a couple of lawyers.
But did they? Sorry, can I just elaborate for the benefits of our audience here? Like, there's an example in a housing chapter where you're talking about a series of black widow spider infestations in, was it student housing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's an actual thing, not like a weird metaphor, but like an actual thing that happened.
Like literal black widow spiders, not a hypothetical example, an actual example. And in the book, it's when Hettie's narrating it, it then says the company responsible explained that this was only in one care home and it was dealt with quickly and speedily, and it was not. And basically, the implication is it's not inherent to the model that you're going to have things like black widow spider infestations because of the pushing down of the debt that we were talking about before. And so I guess I wanted to know, is that how the world of private equity is narrates these problems to themselves? There's always just one bad apple or one bad case study.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's always a sense in which there is this narrative, particularly around things like housing, where it's this really impossible and kind of mythical narrative where you're solving the housing crisis by creating more supply. So that's the thing that a private equity firm invested in housing would argue, that we're the solution because we're helping, because we are providing more housing. And then actually, when you look at the places where they choose to spend their money or to buy up housing, it's always places where there is a rent gap, i.e. a gap between what is actually what a house is being rented for and what it could be rented for. And so the aim is to kind of bridge that gap and eventually reach the point at which you're renting something for much more money. And so it's a kind of, what's a phrase that people used to use in A-level English, like Janus-faced, kind of like it's like a kind of like, there's like, on one hand you're saying you're solving supply or solving the housing crisis, on the other hand you're 100% exacerbating it by putting the rent up. And just as one example of that, I was just curious about this particular student housing development in Edinburgh because I have family there, owned by private equity. Decided to just do some light Googling to see how much it would set me back to rent a flat in one of these student housing blocks that are marketed towards all students, so it's not just foreign students or students who have lots of money. It's all any student can rent one there, and a studio apartment was something like £2,000 more per year than the entire student loan you would receive, like the entire maintenance loan you would receive as a UK student. So I don't know how on earth you'd be supposed to afford that, and it does feel like that is just meaning in a very real and kind of granular sense that it's becoming more expensive for students to rent accommodation, and therefore going to a university in a different city that is not your home city, or even going to university, becomes actually something that feels like further out of reach. And so I don't see how that's really providing supply to solve the housing crisis.
Yeah.
But when it came to the whole process of kind of, I think it's really important to take, obviously from a legal perspective, but also from a kind of journalistic perspective, to take all of the things that you've found during your reporting and say, this is what I've found. Love to speak to somebody about this. If nobody's willing to speak to me, would you be able to just take a look, respond, and so on? And there's a kind of formal process that you go through to do that. Normally, that means receiving in this case, I think it was like a 40-page legal letter that I then had to spend
40.
Something like that, like it took months to go to kind of just, you go through line by line and you check, okay, they've said this, that's what I've said, is it, who, can I go back to them on this, have I got something wrong? And you're really appreciative actually when you do get a long response, because it often means that if there has been one small factual error or something, then you can correct it. But it is also just quite a time sink, and I think I used to hate doing that when I first started out. I would feel like really panicked, I suppose, when those letters would come in, but now it sort of feels like it's just part of the process and it's part of doing it properly, and you're kind of just have a thicker skin, I suppose. But
that seems like a good sign.
It's never fun, but
sure. But if you're getting more used to it, and it's a sign. It's something other investigative journalists have said to me. It's a sign you're doing the right thing if they are. If they're pushing back. And
you're just great. It's I think the people who I've spoken to who had more difficulty with the subjects they write about are those who write about subjects where you just don't get anybody who will do a right to reply. So you're at greater risk of doing something erroneous because you have not actually had that
and
process.
And then getting sued because of it.
You're grateful when the right to reply letter comes in, I think.
Right. It means there's some sort of engagement.
Yeah.
We're slightly running out of time before we move to questions, but so I might just ask then, if to sort of as a final question, the easy one of which I alluded to before, about sort of how we what different mechanisms there might be for restoring some democracy, I suppose, to our relationship with these firms, if they are going to continue to exist at all. There's a interesting proposal at the very end of the book that I didn't know about, from Elizabeth Warren, the former American Democrat presidential candidate, which wasn't taken up in the end, and you say maybe wasn't a perfect solution anyway. I think that was to remove the responsibility to own the debt, right? Is that right?
And I think so basically that was sorry, I'm just writing something down.
While you're doing that, I'm just going to throw in a sort of second part to the question then, but also it feels apt to the fact that we're sitting in Housmans as well. Like what would a popular, and there are popular movements, grassroots movements littered throughout this book who have some cases succeeded in pushing back against the power of private equity. That's what the Danish example is particularly interesting for. Is there a mechanism through the trade unions perhaps for sort of broadening? Writing a very readable and enjoyable book is a very good start to kind of drawing back some of that opacity, but how do we generalise that dissent?
And I think it's always a trouble with non-fiction books that there's like this final chapter of like, here's some solutions, and it sort of feels as though I was hoping that
you wouldn't have to provide any.
Well, no. I think it's really, I think it's really important to think in those terms as well, because it does feel as though it is easy to critique, and actually working on how we solve certain problems is more difficult. And I hope that the book provides a kind of hopefully fun to read, engaging, interesting means of pulling back the curtain that is a starting point. But when I think about what might be done about it, it's almost there's a tendency to, and this is what the Warren proposal did, and that would have been a way of legally making sure that a private equity fund that pushes loads of debt onto a company is basically legally liable for that debt, which sounds really good. problem is that it's quite difficult to enforce. You could imagine big army of very well paid lawyers coming up with all sorts of ways to reclassify firms as not private equity owned firms and all of this kind of thing. And I think that speaks to the risks of trying to section off parts of the kind of problem or parts of the finance industry at large. And actually, you really need a whole host of different solutions that would target different problems that actually are part of even bigger problems. And so there were a few things that I was thinking of when you were asking that question. One is at the level of corporate ownership. I think that it would be really good to see a greater embrace of things like workers on boards, other forms of corporate ownership that are not just about the kind of extraction of wealth and the siphoning of that upwards, but that actually are about the distribution of wealth, or at least the ability to afford workers a greater democratic say in how corporations are run. I think that you'd also want really private equity to play no role in the provision of public services. And I think that means you don't want it to own your water system or your care home. I think that you really do want to start looking at the provision of certain services in a more decommodified way, because when you think of something like the cost of living crisis and the amount of money you have going into your bank account each month and then where that goes, private equity as an industry has increasingly targeted the bits of the bank of the money that goes out that are on things that you have no choice over whether or not you pay for, so water, housing and so on. And I think that's when it starts to really bite, and really we should be looking at providing those things in a way that isn't so commodified and is done so in a way that means that actually I think the cost of living crisis would not be so much of a thing if we weren't paying through our eyes for rent, for example, or for water or for energy. I think people would be a lot happier as well in Britain. I feel like a number of times I've like shaken my fist out of the window at Thames Water digging up the road, and then knowing that we're going to have to pay loads of money next year when our bills go up for something that feels like quite a crap service. And that just feels like, actually, if you were to ask a lot of people what they wanted to see happen politically in Britain, I think they'd probably be like potholes, water, this, that, and you'd be like, okay, maybe those things are really vital starting points. They definitely are. And then I think that the third thing would be the kind of unsexy work of ensuring that regulators really have the power and the tools to, well, not the power, but not the tools, the power and the resources to properly enforce the laws that we already have and to do their jobs properly. And I think there's a tendency amongst politicians to always want to invent a shiny new thing, whether that's a new Ofwat or a new kind of environmental regulator. And actually, when it comes to something like water, some of the reporting I did on the Environment Agency was just quite revealing, in the sense that you had this agency that has all of these laws and tools that it could enforce, but it's been so defunded that the experience of actually trying to get it to do anything in the UK is like pulling a lever and realising that it's not connected to a machine. It's almost this kind of Potemkin regulatory system. And so I think putting some actual heft behind that would be another good starting place. And I think those things taken together, the kind of embrace of other forms of corporate ownership, decommodified public services and more power to regulators would target not just this problem, but a lot of other problems as well that might then start to really improve people's quality of lives. So that's my answer.
That's a very, very good answer. I would only elaborate by suggesting possibly empowering the Environment Agency to put on show trials, perhaps, for the heads of water companies. But Hettie's a serious journalist, I'm not. That's why she's not suggesting that. The water chapter is particularly enraging, I would say, of a number of very enraging chapters. I think we should move to questions, so that because everybody likes a nice, concise event.